Hey everyone, and welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're diving into something super fascinating and, let's be honest, deeply relatable. We're looking at the exact science of how dopamine drives human addiction. We'll explore why our ancient brains get hooked so incredibly fast on modern habits, and what the latest science actually says about taking back control.
Okay, so let's start with a question I know we've all asked ourselves at some point. Why is it so hard to break compulsive habits, even when we have the absolute best intentions? Like, why is it practically impossible to put the phone down, stop snacking on junk food, or quit smoking? Addiction touches millions of lives, right? Yet it's still so often misunderstood as just a personal weakness or a moral failing. But as we'll see today, the real culprit, it's actually the ancient architecture of the human brain itself.
To uncover the answer, we kind of have to investigate the brain like a crime scene. So let's look at Section 1, an ancient survival tool. For literally millennia, human survival depended entirely on our drive to seek out pleasure and avoid pain. Stanford Medicine's Dr. Anna Lembke explains that our drive for dopamine isn't some flaw in our design. No, it's a primal survival mechanism. When we do something good for our survival, like, say, eating when we're hungry or finding shelter, our brain releases dopamine. It's a chemical messenger that makes us feel good and reinforces that exact behavior. And this system has been conserved over millions of years of evolution. I mean, get this, even the most primitive worms are driven by this exact same reward system to move toward food. Crazy, right? That worm fact brilliantly illustrates the core of the issue, which is perfectly captured by Dr. Keith Humphreys, a psychiatry professor and addiction researcher at Stanford Medicine. He says, "We've got an old brain in a new environment. For 99.9% of human evolution, our biological vulnerability to dopamine didn't really matter. So basically, addiction is a hardware mismatch. It's a clash between our ancient biology and today's heavily engineered world." Think about it like this. In a world of scarcity, a dopamine rush kept our ancestors alive. Pursuing things that release dopamine was literally the most important thing you could do. But today, well, industrial chemistry and global commerce provide these massive super rewards that completely overwhelm our delicate system. We are absolutely inundated with ridiculously easy access to things that just light up this reward pathway like a Christmas tree. Which brings us to Section 2, the modern dopamine hijacked. Let's see exactly how our ancient biology gets completely overwhelmed by the world we live in right now. Look around and you'll see we're bombarded by triggers. Sugary and salty foods, endless digital media feeds, slot machines, nicotine, alcohol, the list goes on. And the kicker is, every single one of these things is perfectly engineered to deliver a much faster, far more intense dopamine spike than anything you could ever find in nature. So that very reward mechanism that used to keep us alive, it's suddenly become this massive liability. And because these synthetic triggers are so unbelievably powerful, our brain actually gets confused. It literally starts treating these harmful substances and behaviors as if they're essential for our very survival. The brain elevates a dopamine spike from, say, a slot machine or a vape pen to the exact same level of importance as finding water in a desert. Let that sink in. Moving on to Section 3, chasing normal, the trap. So there's actually a tragic irony to how our brains try to defend themselves against this modern onslaught. It happens through a process called maladaptive learning. First, a substance or behavior causes a massive, totally unnatural dopamine surge. To compensate for this overwhelming flood, your brain does something drastic. It reduces the number and sensitivity of its own dopamine receptors. It literally kills them off to try and restore balance. But here's the severe consequence. Because you now have fewer receptors, it becomes so much harder to feel pleasure, not just from the drug, but from everyday life, which traps you in this vicious cycle where you now have to consume more of the substance just to feel completely normal. To put this into perspective, think about the number 200. A heavy smoker takes about 200 puffs a day. That's roughly the equivalent of a pack, just to maintain a baseline level of dopamine in their system. The brain has created more and more demand to accommodate the constant input. And the effects of the nicotine, things like improved focus or an elevated mood, they become incredibly short-lived.
Dr. Jody Prochaska, a clinical psychologist studying tobacco addiction at Stanford, hits the nail right on the head here. She says, "You're no longer smoking to get high. You're smoking to avoid withdrawal. The pleasure completely vanishes. You're left trapped in a cycle where you're simply dosing yourself continuously just to fight off terrible withdrawal symptoms. At this point, your brain treats the substance as more important than basic needs, like food, safety, or connection."
Section 4, who is most vulnerable? Knowing all this inevitably leads us to wonder, why do some people fall into this biological trap way faster than others? Well, family and twin studies reveal something huge. Roughly 50 to 60%, averaging right around 55%, of addiction risk is purely genetic. This is so absolutely crucial because it deeply destigmatizes the struggle. This is a biological vulnerability, full stop. If you want to know your risk, one of the most important questions you can ask yourself is simply, were my parents addicted? But aside from genetics, there are a few other major risk factors. People who have a harder time pausing between an impulse and an action, they're incredibly vulnerable. This includes individuals dealing with emotional dysregulation or conditions like ADHD and bipolar disorder, and age. Age is a massive factor. Our brains are actually still developing until about age 25. Studies show that being introduced to an addictive substance before that development finishes significantly increases the likelihood and the speed of becoming addicted.
However, we really can't just rely on those classic risk factors anymore. Today's highly potent drugs and perfectly engineered digital media mean that even people who previously considered themselves completely immune to addiction, well, they're getting caught in the loop too. We are seeing diagnoses for opioid, gambling, social media, and other addictions in populations across the board. And it's simply because these modern triggers are so strong, they're overwhelming our shared, ancient dopamine pathways.
All right, let's talk solutions. Section 5, rewiring your brain. How do we actually step out of this trap and help our wonderfully neuroplastic brains recover and rewire? Dr. Lemke notes that the #1 way to return to a healthy brain balance is abstinence. Specifically, she recommends a 30-day abstinence reset. Now, this is a very challenging window, but it's highly effective. If you can push through those 30 days, your brain can clear out the noise and naturally begin to rebuild those diminished dopamine receptors. Plus, it gives you your own raw data on exactly how your body feels without the substance. But look, recovery is a journey. In the early stages, you are going to experience withdrawal, irritability, poor sleep, difficulty concentrating. These intense physical symptoms generally peak right around day 3. By week 4, as your brain's homeostasis starts to return, your mood and sleep actually begin to improve. But there is a lingering shadow you absolutely must be prepared for: cravings. And those can persist for months or even years. Those long-term cravings, they're often due to something called addiction memory. Basically, completely separate from the dopamine pathway. Your brain has stubbornly linked the addictive habit to completely mundane everyday routines. So the urge can be reignited just by driving a certain route to work, feeling a tiny moment of stress, or literally even just pouring a cup of coffee. The environmental triggers remain long after the brain receptors normalize. Now, if a 30-day cold turkey abstinence feels completely impossible, don't worry. Incredible medical tools exist to help people through that initial withdrawal period. For nicotine, we have steady delivery patches paired with gums, or medications like varenicline that actually make smoking less satisfying. There's also some really exciting research right now into psilocybin and a developing plant-derived drug called cytosine. But perhaps most fascinating right now, GLP-1 receptor agonists. You know, those diabetes and weight loss drugs like Ozempic? While they weren't originally designed for addiction, researchers are finding they have unexpected, highly promising benefits in drastically reducing cravings for things like alcohol and nicotine. Which brings us to this incredibly powerful thought from Dr. Lemke. It's not about willpower, it's about the brain adapting. And that perfectly summarizes everything we've talked about in this explainer. Overcoming compulsion is not about rigidly shaming yourself for lacking moral strength. It's about patiently supporting your incredibly resilient brain as it heals, rebuilds its natural reward systems, and remembers how to find joy in everyday connections again. As we wrap up this explainer, I want to leave you with a thought. If our brains are wired for a world of scarcity that just doesn't exist anymore, look around your environment today. Ask yourself, what perfectly engineered modern habit is silently hacking your ancient hardware right now? Understanding the science is the absolute first step in taking your brain back. Thanks so much for joining me to explore the fascinating mechanics behind our dopamine-driven world.